Welcome, I'm Sam Faddis. This is Ground Truth, and we're picking up where we left off in our continuing series on Tibet and China, the Chinese invasion of Tibet, the Tibetan resistance to China, the whole long tragedy. And with us, the same gentleman who's been with us throughout, Jamyang Norbu, who's, I think the simplest definition is that he's a Tibetan patriot because he's a guy who's dedicated literally his entire life to this cause. He's a writer, he's an activist, now lives in the United States. And my favorite part of this whole story, I've said this before in introducing you, is the part where you run off as a young man to join the resistance, because a lot of people spend a lot of time talking and then mysteriously they don't actually ever show up to do anything about the problem. So that says a lot about you. Welcome, sir.
Thank you. Now, just to recap, I think, we've already talked about the formation, the uprisings in 1956 in Eastern Tibet and Northeastern Tibet, and how they were put down with great brutality and, genocidal brutality, and how the refugees came to Lhasa, and then the formation in Lhasa itself of the Four Rivers Six Strangers, the principal resistance group, and then the beginnings of the CIA kind of support for Tibetans.
Right.
That the CIA actually had dropped two teams of agents. These are all Tibetan. There were no American agents involved at all. And one in Lhasa to contact the Tibetan government, and one in Eastern Tibet in Lithang, where the first uprising took place, to put together to help the people who were fighting a guerrilla war there. Now, it was not, a big war against China, but more guerrilla warfare. So that's where we are. And in the beginning of the year of 1959, now this is when, this is where the major kind of Tibetan uprising against the Chinese broke out. And of course, the Tibetans, with our wonderful sense of timing, we left it at a point where the Chinese had already now built two main highways into Tibet from China, one from coming from the north and one from the east. Major highways. More than 5 to 10,000 prisoners died building that. These were principally Chinese Kuomintang soldiers, former kind of soldiers from the Nationalist Army.
Right.
And then, of course, Chinese made a big thing out of it, but it was a huge deal. Then they'd also put in secondary roads all over Tibet now. So this was a bad moment to start an uprising, but people don't choose these things. These things happen. And
Sure.
the military occupation army in central Tibet had now been reinforced with heavy artillery, tanks, armor. They'd even built an airfield now north of Lhasa. They couldn't bring in jets and big bombers because it's too far away from China. It's unlike Eastern Tibet, which is closer. But they still had transport planes running. So So it was a difficult time, that beginning of that year, and also for Tibetans that year was, the whole of this Lhasa city was seething with rumors, and everyone, they didn't know what to do. The whole city was a buzz, especially because people had stuck up posters about the resistance destroying Chinese transport and fighting, and the people were excited. But then there was one kind of fear that Tibetans had, because the Dalai Lama had been invited to Beijing to attend the National People's Congress in 1959. He had earlier attended about 4 years before, but now he was asked to come again. And there was all sorts of rumors that the Chinese would never let him go once he went down. They would use him as a kind of hostage to shut down the resistance. That would be so. There was, that the whole place was in uproar. And then also there was the problem of the Tibetan army, what was left of it. There were at least about 4 or 5 regiments. And the Chinese, according to the treaty we signed, these were supposed to be incorporated into the, People's Liberation Army. But the Tibetan, and although they were much smaller now, the Tibetan, there was not many left, I think about 3 or 4,000, But so there was a problem there with what was left of the army and the police. They were totally anti-Chinese. There were no collaborators in that rank there at all. When the Chinese also, when the uprising took place in Eastern Tibet, the Chinese asked the Tibetan government to use its own soldiers to put down the uprising. Like the way the Afghan army, was used by the Soviets. But the Tibetan government, in a moment of inspiration, they're not always inspired, but in a moment of inspiration, one minister said, I think that's a good idea, but maybe first, we need to, you must give us permission to increase the size of our army, and then we want you to give us, modern weapons, whatever you have. If you let us have it, then we might send soldiers to support you in Eastern Tibet. But then the Chinese, of course, refused to do that. But so the army was now angry. The police were angry in the city. And there were over now 60,000 Chinese troops there. So there were, even in the cities, sometimes there were fights between the Tibetans and the Chinese troops. Sometimes it got so bad that people were actually taking out arms, and and a lot of officials had to run around trying to cool things. But it was a difficult moment, and of course they bought in tanks, armored cars, and at that moment, one Chinese colonel deserted. He was a colonel in the artillery, and he deserted to join the Tibetan resistance. And they somehow found him, sort of amiable, and they took him. And he really was very, very useful. First of all, he told the Tibetans what the art, how the Chinese, artillery positions, everything was around Lhasa.
Sure.
He drew a map for them. Then he joined the resistance himself. He took up a Tibetan name and he joined them. And he was very useful because he was the only person trained to fight,
Sure.
And who knew, and he had fought before, against Japanese, earlier, and he had fought against the Kuomintang. So he had his problems. He really hated the communists. I think they had killed his father, and he had that big grudge. So in this sort of situation, we had the city where now even small underground organizations have started, cells, and people, it was, so when the Dalai Lama got the invitation to attend the People's Congress, that was bad enough. But then, in somewhere around March, after he was young, but he had to give his doctoral examination in theology, And once he had done that, it was a very big moment. It was a public examination, like in Tibet it has to be, and he passed his examination. And the Chinese invited him to a show at their military headquarters in Lhasa to attend a show. And we are not sure whether actually the Chinese were going to use that as a ploy to kidnap him then, but that's what the people in Lhasa, they sort of took that, as an indication that the Chinese were going to, kidnap the Dalai Lama. And on March 10th, over 20,000 people surrounded the Dalai Lama's summer palace, the Noble Inca, and they demanded that, he shouldn't be allowed to go to the Chinese military headquarters. So when the ministers came in, they were all threatened and this and that. And, people said, don't sell our Dalai Lama for Chinese silver. But then one minister had a kind of everyone was scared because the public that came out were all armed. They were all carrying daggers and axes and, what have you. And they were in a very violent mood. Actually, one collaborator there who came was murdered, actually, by the crowd. So it was very tense. And, but then one minister had the inspiration to say, look, and they all wanted to see the Dalai Lama. They wanted to make sure that he hadn't been given up to the Chinese. So he suggested that, they all come to the palace, but why don't they pick their own representatives, about 40 or 50 people, and they could come in. Then actually they picked about 60 or 70 And they came in, and that started actually a kind of Congress, So then these people became a permanent kind of a group. And with that, then Tibetan government officials, senior officials, even former kind of commanders in chief, and all, they met together and they started planning to all public representatives, old government officials, and military people. And then things got out of hand because the Chinese realized that these people were actually going to resist and fight. So the Chinese sort of locked themselves up into their own camps and garrisons. And, the Tibetans started defending all these areas. And very soon, they weren't sure what the Dalai Lama was going to be, but they, some of the people managed to, try to initially, he wasn't sure what he was going to do, but they managed to get him out. They said, look, if you stay here, there's going to be violence. So you better leave. If you leave, the public might go away. So, but then, one of the problems, as I told you earlier, that the Chinese had built secondary roads. They had protected all the frontiers. The normal places where you went to India, the borders were all sealed. So one route was left. That was from Lhasa, direct south, and that was to the Indian state of Assam, many hundred miles away. But that route was still open because the resistance had built their headquarters there in the south. And although the main resistance army was fighting in Eastern Tibet, they had, they had about 1,000 sort of resistance fighters in that place. And they had managed to besiege the major garrisons in this town called Setang. And the Chinese were in a hill, but that was the route that the Dalai Lama would have to take anyway. There was no other place. But the resistance, through sheer luck, they managed to put the Chinese army under siege. And there was a lot of fighting there. Many people were killed. The Chinese hung in there. They didn't surrender that garrison. Then the Tibetans started to mine it, the old idea. They dug tunnels, and then they put explosives in and try to make blow the Chinese apart. And, success was not complete, but they managed to push the Chinese back. So finally, they managed to make the Chinese completely, in some ways, unable to move from there. And in that, because of that, and because the CIA had sent one group of agents to that area, the Dalai Lama they managed to spirit him out of Tibet, and finally even CIA agents, sending radio messages back to headquarters. Finally, the Indian government was informed that the Dalai Lama was on its way, and finally he managed to get out. But then the fighting broke out all over. Even after he left, suddenly the fighting broke out.
So let me ask you a couple of questions just to sort of emphasize a couple of things here. First of all, I have read accounts that claim that it was the Central Intelligence Agency that got the Dalai Lama out of Tibet. Is that true? Because it doesn't sound like it's true.
No, it wasn't. They got the first message because two of their agents were with the Dalai Lama. I mean, these Tibetans, basically.
Right, and when you say agents, as you emphasized before, and this is true in CIA speak all the time, an agent is not an American. An agent is the local national, in this case, Tibetans.
Tibetans, yeah, who were actually now with the resistance. So they were the two radio operators, basically. And they informed the first person to get information, of course, was the CIA headquarters. And then they told the American State Department, who at once sent a message to Delhi to ask Prime Minister Nehru to provide sanctuary to the Dalai Lama. So the CIA was not involved in this. And even these two radio operators were not principal of the Dalai Lama's escape.
They're just passing along the information.
Yeah. And they were useful, of course. They were very useful. But the main escape was planned by the Dalai Lamas. people in his own government. People were totally fed up with the Chinese.
So here's the
You know,
other thing, that the other aspect, and I think probably most people, certainly most people that are listening to this show, have some vague sense that the Dalai Lama is an important guy who's
yeah.
who's. But what is the Dalai? First of all, I mean, what does that mean? What is the Dalai Lama, and what is the significance of the Dalai Lama to the Tibetan people? Like, why, for the average person who's listening to this, okay, so some guy got out. What's the big deal? Because it's a
Mhm.
very big deal.
Yeah.
It's a huge deal.
Yeah. So let me sort of provide you some kind of answer here. The
Sure.
Dalai Lama is principally the sovereign ruler of Tibet. He, and it is. It's not like the Pope in a sense, because the Pope is, like according to Christian theology, he's sort of representative of God on earth. The Dalai Lama actually was a spiritual leader in Tibet, who around the 15th century, in alliance with Mongols at that time, the Khoshat Mongols, they managed to reunify Tibet. And the Dalai Lama became the spiritual leader of the Mongols and also of the Tibetans. And then he established a kind of a dynasty, but not in sense of his sons and carrying on, but his reincarnated kind of personage. So what you had now was the 14th reincarnation of the Dalai Lama, and these are political leaders. They were spiritual leaders also, because they were people who were trained in Buddhist theology, but they were political leaders also, and they ruled over a government which is split between a clerical wing and a lay wing of secular government officials. And by this time in Tibet, the secular government officials especially, there was this, although the Chinese had played their cards as carefully as possible, the Tibetan government realized that, the way the Chinese were carrying on, what had happened in Eastern Tibet, that this would happen again in Central Tibet now, no matter what the Chinese did. So they knew that this was their last opportunity to strike a blow, especially to get the Dalai Lama, who was like the symbol of Tibet, out of Chinese reach, because the Chinese were really working on the Dalai Lama. And the Dalai Lama was very young, and he was impressionable. He was at that age, when
Sure.
new ideas, he would absorb them. And the communist kind of ideology, you can present it in the most idealistic of terms. And that's what the Chinese were doing. The Chinese were claiming that even the Buddha himself must be accepted as a true communist hero, because he gave up the throne of his father.
Oh my God. The Buddha
You
is a
can spin it
communist.
anyway. Yeah, you can spin it anyway, So they were very good. And they treated the Dalai Lama with kid gloves. The Mao Zedong actually even told the Dalai Lama, if any Chinese general in Lhasa, sort of disobeys you, argues with you, tell me, I'm going to throw him right out. You are the person that is most important to us. So the problem really was that the Dalai Lama was torn between, and the Chinese were saying what they're going to do is really just reform Tibet, bring about, Tibet. This is an old country. In many ways, there was elements of feudalism. Like farmers needed reforms. There should have been land redistribution and reforms. But although it was not a country in starvation or extreme despotism, it was not exactly a democratic country. And the Chinese said they were going to bring in democratic socialism. That's what they called it. So the Dalai Lama was unsure. So that his ministers and his Lord Chamberlain, they plotted his escape, and they did it very well. Even now when I study this, it impresses me how really good they were at keeping their secrets. Because there are spies all over Lhasa city, everywhere. But these guys managed to keep their secrets, plan this entire escape, not only just plan it in sense, because you couldn't just leave. They had to have horses. They had to have provisions for this. Is a journey that would take them a month. They would need bodyguards. They would have to trust troops some groups, but they managed to do it in such a way the Chinese had no idea what was going on.
Right. Well, when you think about it, this is, I mean, everything that you've just said obviously resonates with me, but back to what you were saying a few minutes ago, this is not just a guy. In other words, it's not just let's get somebody out of Lhasa and escape the Chinese and make it to India. If there's a guy in all of Tibet that the
Mm-hmm.
entire Chinese effort is focused on, it's it's the Dalai Lama, because as you've said, I mean the Chinese are not, I mean they'll bomb and commit genocide and do this, but maybe the most insidious thing they do is what they do mentally to people. The way they brainwash people, the way they use propaganda, the way they co-opt people. You keep referring to collaborators. Here's the number one guy in the whole country that Mao Zedong and the Chinese Communist Party wants to co-opt. If there's a key to
Yeah.
keeping control of Tibet, it's getting the Dalai Lama to say, I'm with these guys. So every eye in Tibet has to be watching this guy, and yet they managed to take him right out from under the Chinese noses over
Mm-hmm.
this incredible terrain and get him completely out of the country, safe and sound, which has
Yeah.
got to
So
be
I
one of the
won't
most
go.
remarkable
Yeah.
operations in history.
Yeah. It's very impressive, and I won't go into detail, but I was so impressed that they didn't. Although they knew, like many of the officials that they were, with the Dalai Lama were not really Chinese spies. But even the fact that, he might have a relative who was friendly to the Chinese or who belonged to one Chinese setup. Chinese set up the Women's Association and things. So they were very careful, like even indirect kind of, exposure of their plan
Sure.
would not do. So not there were not that many collaborators, to be fair. Also, I mean,
Hmm.
it was not like Afghanistan
Right.
where you actually had civil war. Here, most of the army, actually, I could say like 90% of the army, 100% of the police were you know, were fighting for the Dalai Lama. And for them, the Dalai Lama was the great symbol of Tibetan unity because the fifth Dalai Lama actually, after Tibet had, the empire had been split up, and that was a big moment in Tibetan history. He was the one who managed to reunite it. The fifth Dalai Lama reunited this whole thing. So the Dalai Lamas were very important from the political and both the spiritual point of view. So, but that when they finally got him, they managed to even send messages to the resistance to, finally manage to pin down the Chinese kind of garrisons on the way to make sure they couldn't move and to get the Dalai Lama out. And then the fighting broke out all over Lhasa. And it was very savage. Chinese, used, except for the center where they couldn't use artillery because, Chinese officers and were cheek by jowl with the Tibetan fighters there.
Hmm.
Otherwise, all other places like the Potala Palace, the Summer Palace, number of other places, they just use heavy artillery. They just bombarded the place. And the Tibetans also, we had about 15 or 20 howitzers. So our people started using whatever howitzers we had, but they fought. People did fight. Even officials who had never really, and older people from Lhasa State, the moment they heard there was fighting, old gentlemen like 60, 70 years old said, I have to go to the Dalai Lama's palace to defend him. So they picked up a handgun or whatever they had and they went out there. And of course, they got massacred. But the fact that these people went, even now their children and whatever family they have, they're very proud of them.
Of
So
course.
many people, business people, people, government officials, even monks, everyone went, to defend the Dalai Lama's palace. So the fighting took 3 days, and they destroyed much of not the Potala itself because it's very solid, but the Dalai Lama's summer palace, and that's where the main kind of Tibetans were holding out. We're not sure now, there in this fighting, people, there must have been at least 10 or 20,000 people dead by the end of it. Then the Chinese, the moment the fighting stopped, they bought in tanks towards the end. They had to bring the tanks from a distance. So tanks rolled in on the third day and surrounded the whole city. And then people had to, like, I had relatives there. One grandfather of mine, grand uncle, he was one of the leaders there. They were all arrested. And nearly all the male population of the city were arrested and processed. And then about half was sent to China and to military headquarters and to Laogai camps in China, where many of them perished of starvation. Because this after 59, 60, 61, then you had the great famines in China, and so this was really a terrible, terrible moment for Tibetans there. Families were separated. So the whole city was in lockdown for months on end. And of course, they destroyed in the next, opposite the Potala Palace, there's the very old College of Medicine, on a hill by itself. And completely flattened. Even now, they haven't rebuilt anything. They put up a microwave tower on the top, communications tower. But the whole city was completely flattened. And then the Chinese completely took over. There was no shred of the Tibetan government left at all. So that was the end of the Tibetan government. But when the Dalai Lama escaped, actually, he managed to take nearly his entire cabinet, except the one minister who was a traitor, the one who signed the 17-point agreement, who first one to surrender, when the Chinese invaded. He was kept in the Chinese power structure. Otherwise, nearly all the other ministers managed to escape to India with the Dalai Lama. So the escape was surprising. It wasn't only the Dalai Lama. They managed to get the Tibetan government out. All the major religious sort of leaders from the 4 different Buddhist schools of Buddhism in Tibet. Also, some of the Dalai Lama's family, most of the members managed to escape. So by the time they got to India, they actually had quite a nice exile setup, which gave us an advantage in spite of all the problems that we had. We managed to keep our kind of game going. So, even when we were in exile, and even then the resistance, a lot of the members had to, when the Chinese then started pouring in troops from China, a lot of the resistance had to escape. But then the CIA they kept up their relationship with the exile government and with the Tibetan resistance. And then they kept, actually, instead of just supporting, resistance based around central Tibet, they actually had now air teams dropped into places in Eastern Tibet. So about 8 or 9 teams were dropped in areas in Eastern Tibet, where guerrilla fighting was going on. But the moment the people in these ground areas heard that there was American support, that there was an American team there, they'd be getting weapons, tens of thousands of people might flock to these areas, sir. Once again. And then, this was, so they couldn't really, although the CIA did advise Tibetans to just conduct guerrilla warfare, you had too many people coming there.
Right.
The moment the rumors came, Americans here are going to get weapons, you got 10, 20,000 people, and there's nothing that a team that had been sent in, like for 10 people.
Right.
How can they control it? And these people were just, but then the CIA kept on dropping weapons. So there were men, each time one team was dropped, after them there's about 10 supply planes, like C-130s, dropped weapons. And after a while they were dropping Garand rifles, which is for Tibetans, that they love this rifle. But they don't want really fully automatic weapons. Everyone knows that, you have to conserve ammunition.
Exactly.
So, so the Garand rifle was, in some ways, the ideal thing for these people. And then they dropped in also anti-tank capabilities, like they dropped in the recoilless rifles,
Right.
70, 80 millimeter, so
Right.
and anti-aircraft heavy machine guns on stands. So, like although the Chinese in some of these areas, they bought in jets, they bought in tanks, Tibetans are fighting them, all the way. In the end, of course, just the size of the army, that the Chinese poured into these areas, ensured that the Tibetans wouldn't survive. But the Tibetans actually, in some areas, they fought to the last man. Some of these teams, didn't survive at all. Out of 80, 90 people, one person might have survived, been knocked by unconscious by a grenade blast or something,
Right.
and Chinese captured him. Because other people, also, they were captured, they bit into their poison pills. They didn't want to be captured. And the CIA issued them the cyanide pills.
Right.
So, I mean, this was fighting on a very, very large scale. These people, they knew it's either you win or you just die.
Right.
And it got to a point where the Chinese also, like I had a friend who fought in the northernmost area on armed plan. Then he said, after a while, they kept up a retreat, and they said the Chinese were chasing them day after day. And he said it got to a point like one day when he turned around, he said, let's fight it out. And he went there. The Chinese following him were actually on their last legs also. They were on the ground. He said they were dying. Their lips were cracked. They could barely breathe at the altitude.
Yeah.
They're frozen. There's like 100 or 200 people that had to do it because otherwise, if they went back, the officers might shoot them.
Of course.
But then they were dying there. He said, I didn't even bother wasting my ammunition. He knew that within the next 24 hours, these people, the Chinese soldiers there, would be dead. So, I mean, it was the fighting there, like not only at Lhasa, but then after Lhasa, all the CIA teams, 8 teams were sent there. One last team was sent in 1961 into one of the largest areas in Eastern Tibet called Markham. Team of 7 people, and I interviewed quite a lot of the people. One of the persons who survived, but they were totally, the resistance army there in Markham, which at one point was even 30,000 people, had been reduced in the end to like about 60 guerrilla fighters. And when the CIA-sponsored team joined them, these people were chased through the forests, and it got to a point where in the end there was nothing left except one of the agents who had a Chinese soldier had hit him on the with the butt of his rifle on his head, knocked him unconscious. That person survived. The entire army got wiped out. So you had a situation now where, the Dalai Lama managed to get out. The resistance cell still kept on operating, even in exile. And many of them, of course, escaped Tibet, to India. And then from India, there was a conference and they decided they had to start another base. So then they moved to Mustang, the base that I went to much later. Mm-hmm. It's on the border of Nepal and Tibet. Mm-hmm. And which is actually, it was, part of Tibet, the old Tibet before.
Right.
And in the beginning, the Nepalese didn't object to our presence there because they were also nervous of a Chinese invasion.
Sure.
So that was the point when the Chinese, had talked about the 5 fingers, not only Tibet, but, Bhutan, Arunachal Pradesh, Sikkim, Nepal, they claimed all these areas as part of the PRC. So for a while, then we managed to set things up there. It was very difficult, but the CIA weren't too keen on setting up a big army there. But eventually, like whether the CIA liked it or not, the Tibetans did it themselves, The people went there. And, when you had 2,000 or 3,000 people, they have to be fed. So eventually the CIA decided, well, yeah, we might as well support them. And they dropped weapons. And there's another, and from there, then Tibetans started conducting raids again into Tibet. We end on the story of one raid, which is very important. Of the number of raids that, and because the area is close to one of the major all-weather roads that the Chinese have coming into Tibet. And some of the raids were very savage, like especially like the areas, these areas are very desolate. So Chinese were, they're really scared. For them, it's like a suicide mission to be told to drive a truck in these areas.
Sure.
But in 61, and this guy was a buddy of mine when I was in Mustang, much older person, very funny, but someone who was totally crazy, but who was very lucky in war. What Tibetans said, he had the kind of a warlike star. He was born under that star. Wherever he went, there was always action. You could actually wander around. Tibet is quite big, and
Sure.
Chinese are not everywhere. So, but this guy, he took a team of 20 men, and then they prepared an ambush for a Chinese convoy. And finally, one solitary truck came, and everyone said, let that truck go. We'll wait. He said, why let it go? Let's destroy that truck, and we'll wait for the others also. And when they destroyed that truck, they realized that nearly all the people in that truck were officers.
Important truck.
And then they found, and there was a colonel, the secretary, a Chinese woman, wearing a Mao cap, and then a lot of documents. And so they took that document, like about, I think, 7 or 8 big bags, and then a dispatch bag also, So it was not only documents, but Chinese PLA publications. This guy, his job, it seemed, was to distribute the latest newsletters and orders from Beijing to all the Tibetan, the commands in the whole Tibet area. So he had a lot of this, everything. And when they took this to Calcutta and gave it to the American, agent there, CIA agent, they were all surprised. Like nobody realized that China, they had the Great Leap Forward.
Right.
Where which totally failed. Mao's great kind of economic, genius, that famines that happened. People weren't aware that these things that happened in China. Like even the academics, in Harvard, John King Fairbank, who was the sort of the dean of Chinese studies, China studies in Harvard. He said, no, there'll never be famine in China now under Mao. That's a thing of the past,
Yet another expert who's wrong.
Oh, absolutely. And there were many. And to be fair, there were from Hong Kong 1 or 2 China watchers. One Jesuit priest was really good, who suspected this. There's so many bodies floating out of the Pearl River,
Right.
into Hong Kong. And, he interviewed Hong Kong people, refugees, and he managed to put together, he said 40 to 50 million people in that famine, 3-year famine.
Yep.
And now it's very close. The latest one, I think, figures are 55 from a Chinese researcher. So this was something that was totally unsuspected. So for the CIA, this was a huge coup. When they took the bag, they took it back to Langley. And then after Langley, the experts went through it, they issued it to the press. So the New York Times, actually, the next year came out with this headline news, about what had happened in China. I remember even a Time magazine, kind of a cover story about, China in pieces, basically. And it was a country now, through their own internal mistakes, and ego, and, they had turned China basically was just starving to death. So this was the really big moment for the CIA. It was so big because at that time, no other agency in the world had information like this at all. They got it, and they got it through the Tibetan program.
All because of one guy and had the right instincts to do the right thing.
So they have actually, do you know the CIA has a, art gallery?
Yes, I do know.
And now, they have a painting that was on this. It's called the capture of the, what document I didn't call it. And they have the Tibetan painting of Tibetan guerrillas burning this truck and running out with.
I didn't know that. Now I have to see that picture.
It's not very good because they imagine it's, the artist, not his fault.
Of
it's
course.
Just one bag. Actually, they said it was many bags because it was also, it was also manuals and things that had been issued, maps and everything. And also it was very reassuring for the CIA because among a lot of the Chinese kind of documents there were also reappraisals by the PLA command on the behavior of communist troops. They said that Chinese troops had to learn from the Tibetans. If the Tibetans, though, move their attack, they just don't cower. They manage to fight back immediately. They try to surprise you. And the way they conserve their ammunition, the way Tibetans also make sure that no radios, nothing is left behind.
Yes.
So there was a lot of, so when the CIA got all this information, it assured Washington that they hadn't, that they had invested quite wisely in this whole project. So this is, so when I got up to Masang, I just heard stories. By that time, when I was there, a lot of the operations had stopped to a certain extent. The CIA had told us not to conduct any more raids into Tibet, because one of the raids, actually, the Tibetan commander didn't know. One person representing a television company had managed to tell lies, pretend he was part of the CIA, and had actually taken a team of Tibetans and gone on a big raid inside Tibet. And it was an English television company. I think it was ITF or one of those.
Yeah.
And in '66, they came out with actually quite an interesting, called Raid into Tibet, one documentary, But then the CIA got very nervous about, So when I got there, the raids weren't happening, but there was always talk. So I was always hopeful, that.
So what year did you go to Mustang?
69. Yeah.
And so that base was set up 61. Is that
61,
right?
yeah, 61 onwards, yes. Yeah. So we managed to hang on there for about 9 or, even like 10, 11 years. But the thing was, it was in some ways, it was a permanent organization. There were about 14 different camps, major sort of encampments, the permanent buildings, and supply lines. We even built, the Khampas are very good builders, So because they're very good with building adobe, and rammed earth houses. So they built not only barracks, but they even built temples and libraries, and also on the road. The road is really difficult coming up from Nepal all the way. They had built wonderful tracks and even bridges on some of these areas. So it benefited the locals also to some extent, although and we bought supplies from the locals. So there was even like business, we never really just, we did have the money from the CIA enough to buy supplies from the locals. So the locals also treated us, didn't treat us with any real hostility. Sure. In fact, a lot of their business people benefited. When our troops moved up and down, we would eat in their eating houses or drink, especially when you had a break, we'd go down to the village and have a shot, of their arak,
Right.
And, and sort of fool, tease the girls or something. And, they were all Tibetan speaking anyway in that area, most of the people there. So we managed to hang in there for a long time until the Nepalese, they really, by the time, it got towards the end, the Nepalese were getting closer to the Chinese by that time, And the Chinese were getting far more diplomatic with Nepal. They had given them aid, and the Indians were treating the Nepalese sort of badly at that point. And the Nepalese really wanted us out. So that was when actually I was also used when I was up there. Because I spoke Nepali, the language, because I came from a school in Darjeeling, where that was the local language. And since I also spoke English, I was asked to conduct most of the talks between the resistance and the Nepalese government. I was their kind of spokesperson. So I used to meet these Nepalese officers, and you could see they really didn't want us there, in Nepalese government. And they thought they had a ploy. They would always ask me, look, it doesn't matter if you have weapons up there. We can give you a license for anything. They said, even if you have machine guns and you have artillery, we'll give you licenses. Just let us know what you have. And of course, I would pretend and say, no, we don't have anything. We just have few,
Sure.
heirlooms,
That
like
sounds like another that sounds like another trick like the one you described where the Tibetans tell the Chinese, "Sure, we'll help you, just give us new guns." That's
yeah.
it's the
And
same kind of trick.
so, but then the Mustang, the whole Mustang operations, it ended finally, like it got to a point where, they really, because there were Tibetan refugees in Nepal itself, in Kathmandu also, large numbers.
Right.
And they were being threatened. And finally, they managed to arrest one of our sort of administrators. Because by the time the CIA, then after Nixon's visit to China, the CIA then had to pull back its support for Tibetans. So they let us have in three installments, what they call an alimony, and with enough money so that the Tibetans could set up all sorts of small industries, carpet weaving, like in shops and hotels all over Nepal, so that we could, so the remaining troops could survive. But then when one of our administrators, and the Nepalese government was supposed to actually approve of this also, but when one of our administrators went down to Nepal, he was arrested. That the Nepalese demanded that the Tibetans surrender their weapons. And finally, the Dalai Lama's representative was sent to the camps and who explicitly ordered all the Tibetans to surrender their weapons. And a lot of people committed suicide. But then, orders are orders, so they had to.
So what year is this now?
This we are getting 74.
Okay.
And then that was the end of that.
And after, as you indicated, Nixon's trip to China and really what I would describe as the beginning of Henry Kissinger's foreign policy, which is
carrying on.
We've got to accept these guys, the communists. We've got to I would characterize Kissinger's foreign policy as a step further than that. They're going to win. We're going to lose. We need to accept it. Let's just manage America's decline, and along the way, we're going to sell out a whole lot of people. I mean, that's my opinion. I'm not putting those words in your mouth. That's my opinion.
For me, the even more unfortunate thing is there's this huge element of greed involved.
Yes.
Right from the beginning, with people like Henry Kissinger, it's totally self-serving. It's not, if it was just done, purely, in a pragmatic way, that this is American foreign policy, like we can't fight everyone. And if they could actually say, yeah, we have to make compromises now and then, and if it is realistic and it didn't involve making money of the Chinese, it's another story. One has to sort of accept certain things. But in this, there's always this element where these people are making millions and millions of dollars. Huh? Kissinger Associates, these are the company, and then it just carried on later. And of course, it's Bill Clinton, and of course George Bush Sr. was really gung ho, in this also. Then Clinton, and
I couldn't agree with you more. And this is, I think, we've now jumped decades ahead to today. To me, the most insidious thing, I know I keep overusing that word, but somehow it resonates with me. The most insidious thing about what has happened with our relationship with the Chinese is exactly what you just put your finger on. Because what we have now are very powerful Americans and very powerful American interests who make so much money off of their relationship with China that is more important to them than anything. Not just the Tibetan people, not just the Chinese people. I would say, as an American, more important than the American people. It's more important than anything. They don't care about organ harvesting, Tibet,
Yeah,
slave labor camps. They don't care about towns all over the United States where the jobs have all gone away because they're making more money than anybody ever made in history.
yeah, yeah,
And
absolutely.
they don't care. They have sold out everything for that. And they will look right now, as you and I are talking today, Hong Kong.
Yeah,
And you've got Hong Kong demonstrators singing the American national anthem and waving American flags. And you have powerful Americans arguing that we shouldn't anger Beijing, we shouldn't overreact. Exactly what you said. They're more interested in the money than they are in anything
yeah.
else. And as an American, that makes me sick to my stomach. That makes me want to vomit. I'm
No, that,
like, that's not what this country is
you
about.
know, the sad thing for me was, there was a moment in history when, with the fall of the Berlin Wall, and in China with the collapse of the Chinese economy under Mao, there was a moment when, democracy, could have become supreme throughout the world. It had this wonderful opportunity. And you had in the former Soviet Union, you had
Yes,
a wonderful partner like, Gorbachev, a
yes,
person who was complete straight shooter,
yes,
who actually, you know, uh, who actually, like, we know, dismantled the Communist Party. He dismantled, like Russia's arsenal also. He was the one who first saw the danger really of nuclear weapons, and he pushed forward for eventual kind of disarmament with the United States, who liberalized the Russian economy. Maybe he wasn't too good at doing it, but he marginalized the Communist Party completely, you know. And as someone like him, when it was getting difficult, when the Russian economy was falling apart and people were just blaming him, and when he asked the West for help, to a point where even someone as cold-hearted as Margaret Thatcher appealed to the Americans. They said, "Look, this is the one sincere person friend we have there.
right.
Why don't we help him out?"
Help him out. Encourage this. Yeah.
Yeah, people weren't bothered. They're
And
like,
we didn't. No.
people are making too much money off, the Russian economy with all the corrupt kind of oligarchs there at the time. So
Yeah.
I
Well.
mean,
Well. Listen. I think um, this is what I'd like to do. I'd like to break here for today,
okay, yeah,
and I would like to talk with you next time, assuming you've got the time, about come back to Tibet and what is the reality in Tibet today,
okay.
and talk
But yeah,
about and talk
I
about that.
I could do one short account also because the resistance is not finished even in Tibet, even after that. During the Cultural Revolution, which happened in the mid 66 onward, when China was in total chaos, Tibetans used that opportunity. And there was a moment when a Tibetan Joan of Arc came, a woman.
So you mentioned this to me before, and I had
Yeah,
forgotten. So let's pick up there next
yeah.
time.
I can give you like a 10 minutes account of.
Let's talk about that, and then I want to just come back. Because here's I want to come back and talk about Tibet today because the whole reason we're having these conversations, from my standpoint,
Yeah,
is because the Chinese basically want everyone to forget about Tibet.
yeah, yeah,
I mean, in the sense of being a country, being a culture, being a people. Ancient history, forget about it. And we've spent a lot
yeah.
of time talking about very important history. But I want to remind people, okay, this is not just in the history books, man. This is all of this
Mhm.
horrible stuff happened in the past, but it still hasn't been made right. All these years later,
It's happening.
right
Yeah,
now, for real, in Tibet, people still live under this horrible occupation.
yeah.
And just that's, I mean, people intellectually know that, but they need reminded of it. They need to have it rubbed in their faces a little bit. Does
Yeah,
that
we
sound?
could do a 20-minute thing. A 10-minute, I could explain the last
Sure.
Tibetan uprisings, and then, what's going on right
And
now.
then let's bring it in. Sounds good to me.
Yeah. Okay,
So
great. Yeah.
thank you for talking to me today.
Oh, my pleasure. Yeah.
And thank you for listening.
So,
We'll
yeah,
talk to
next
you.
week.
And thank you for listening. We'll talk to you next time on Ground Truth.